I tugged at the collar of my ranger uniform one more time before pulling open the passenger door of the patrol vehicle. The fabric still felt stiff against my neck, and I wondered if it would ever feel natural wearing it. 3 weeks into the job, and I was still adjusting everything twice before it felt right. Alfred Fowler was already behind the wheel, checking his radio and making notes on his clipboard. He looked up when I climbed in, giving me a quick nod. The guy had been doing this for nearly 20 years, and it showed in how he moved. Everything deliberate, practiced. His uniform looked like it had been tailored specifically for him, while mine still felt like I was wearing someone else's clothes. "Ready for another exciting evening in paradise?" Alfred asked, turning the key in the ignition. I buckled my seatbelt and settled back into the seat. "Ready as I'll ever be." The engine rumbled to life, and Alfred pulled us out of the ranger station parking lot. I watched the building disappear in the side mirror, its lights growing smaller as we headed toward the main forest roads. This was my 4th patrol with Alfred, and I was starting to get a feel for the routine. Check the popular camping areas, make sure the fire restrictions were being followed, keep an eye out for anything unusual. So far, the most exciting thing we'd encountered was a family of raccoons that had figured out how to open a particularly stubborn cooler. Alfred steered us onto the main access road that wound deeper into Cascade National Forest. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches creating a canopy overhead that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. I'd grown up in the city, where the tallest thing around was a 5-story apartment building. Being surrounded by these massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks still felt overwhelming sometimes. "See that clearing up ahead on the left?" Alfred pointed through the windshield as we approached a break in the tree line. I leaned forward to get a better look. "Yeah, I see it. That's where we had the bear incident last summer. Family from Portland decided to set up camp right there, even though there were signs posted about bear activity in the area. Mother bear with 2 cubs came through around midnight looking for food. What happened?" Alfred slowed the vehicle as we passed the clearing. Nobody got hurt, thankfully. But the family lost most of their supplies, and we had to escort them out of the forest. Spent the next 3 days tracking the bears to make sure they hadn't gotten too comfortable around human food. I made a mental note about the location. Alfred had been doing this kind of thing since I started, pointing out spots where things had happened, sharing stories about past incidents. I figured it was his way of teaching me what to watch for, helping me understand the forest and the people who came through it. We continued down the winding road, and Alfred kept up his informal tour guide routine. He pointed out a trailhead where they'd had to rescue a hiker with a broken ankle 2 months ago, then a spot where someone had tried to build an illegal campfire during the height of fire season. Each story came with details about what had gone wrong and how they'd handled it. "The thing about this job," Alfred said as we rounded another bend, "is that most people think the forest is just like a city park. They don't understand that out here. A small mistake can turn into a big problem real fast." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I fully grasped what he meant yet. My training had covered emergency procedures and safety protocols, but Alfred's stories made it clear that the real education happened out here on patrol. The radio crackled with a brief check-in from another ranger unit, and Alfred responded with our location and status. Everything normal, everything quiet. I was starting to understand why some of the more experienced rangers called these evening patrols windshield time. Long stretches of driving through empty forest roads, watching for problems that usually weren't there. "That trail marker up there," Alfred said, gesturing toward a wooden sign barely visible in the growing dusk, "leads to one of the more remote camping areas. We'll need to check that tomorrow during the day shift. Too easy to miss things when it's getting dark." I tried to read the sign as we passed, but the light was fading fast. The forest had a different quality at this time of evening. Everything seemed quieter, more closed in. During my daytime patrols, the woods felt open and welcoming. Now, with shadows stretching across the road and the canopy blocking out most of the sky, it felt like we were driving through a tunnel. Alfred turned on the headlights, and the beams cut through the gathering darkness ahead of us. I watched the white lines of the road disappear under our vehicle, hypnotized by the steady rhythm of our progress. The radio stayed quiet, and the only sounds were the engine and the occasional creak of the vehicle's suspension as we hit bumps in the asphalt. "You getting used to the night shifts yet?" Alfred asked. "I think so. It's different than I expected." "Different how?" I thought about how to explain it. "Quieter, I guess. During the day, there's always something happening. Hikers asking for directions, families setting up camps, people fishing at the lake. At night, it feels like we're the only people for miles." Alfred nodded. "That's because we probably are. Most folks don't realize how big this forest actually is. You could walk for days without seeing another person if you knew where to go." The idea made me slightly uncomfortable, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was just the newness of it all, being responsible for such a vast area, knowing that if something went wrong out here, help could be a long way off. We approached another curve in the road, this one sharper than the others we'd navigated. Alfred slowed down as we came around it, the headlights sweeping across the trees on the far side. That's when I saw it. Standing directly in the middle of the road, maybe 50 yards ahead of us, was a figure unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, with arms that hung down past where its knees should be. The proportions were all wrong. The torso too long, the head misshapen and tilted at an odd angle. It wasn't moving, just standing there in our headlight beams like it was waiting for something. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, maybe wearing some kind of costume or stilts. But as we got closer, I could see that whatever this was, it wasn't human. The way it stood was too still, too unnatural. No person could maintain that posture, and no costume could create those proportions. "What is that?" I asked, leaning forward in my seat to get a better look. Alfred's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I noticed his foot had moved to the brake pedal. "Turn around," he said, his voice suddenly urgent. "What?" "Turn around, now." I looked at him, confused. Shouldn't we check if someone needs help? Maybe it's... "Turn around." Alfred's voice was sharp, more forceful than I'd ever heard it. The intensity in his tone caught me off guard. This was the same guy who'd been calmly telling stories and pointing out landmarks just minutes ago. Now he looked tense, almost panicked. "Alfred, what's going on?" But he was already spinning the wheel, executing a quick 3-point turn in the narrow road. The headlights swept across the trees as we turned, and for a moment, everything was shadows and confusion. When we completed the turn and I looked back toward where the figure had been standing, the road was empty. Completely empty. I twisted in my seat, trying to see if the thing had moved into the trees or stepped off the road, but there was nothing there, just empty asphalt stretching back into the darkness. "Where did it go?" I asked. Alfred didn't answer. He was focused on driving, taking us back the way we'd come at a speed that seemed faster than necessary. His jaw was set, and he kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The radio crackled, and the dispatcher's voice filled the vehicle. "Unit 7, what's your status?" Alfred grabbed the radio without hesitation. "Unit 7, all clear. Continuing patrol." All clear? I stared at him. We'd just seen something that definitely wasn't clear, something that didn't make any sense at all. But Alfred was acting like nothing had happened. "Alfred," I said, keeping my voice low even though there was nobody else around to hear us. "What was that thing back there?" "Nothing. That wasn't nothing. That was..." "Drop it, Bryce." His tone made it clear the conversation was over, but I couldn't just let it go. I'd seen what I'd seen, and pretending it hadn't happened wasn't going to make it disappear from my memory. "Look." I know something was standing in that road. Something big, and when we turned around, it was gone. Things don't just vanish like that. Alfred kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. For a long moment, I thought he wasn't going to respond at all. Then he spoke, his voice quiet, but firm. Some things in these woods are better left alone, Bryce. You do well to remember that." The way he said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just advice. It was a warning. And the fact that he wouldn't even acknowledge what we'd both clearly seen made it worse somehow. I settled back in my seat, but my mind was racing. What kind of animal could stand upright like that? What kind of person could be that tall, with those proportions? And how had it disappeared so completely in the few seconds it took us to turn around? Alfred reached for the radio again and called in our position, reporting that we were heading back toward the main station. His voice was steady and professional, giving no indication that anything unusual had happened. But I could see his hands on the steering wheel, and they were gripping it tighter than they needed to be. I barely made it through the front door of the ranger station before hearing my name called from across the main office. "Johnston, my office, now." Raymond Santiago's voice carried that particular tone that meant trouble. The kind of tone that made every other ranger in the building suddenly find their paperwork incredibly fascinating. I caught a few sideways glances as I walked past the duty desk, but nobody made eye contact. That wasn't a good sign. The chief's office sat at the back of the building, separated from the main floor by a wall of windows that he kept covered with Venetian blinds. I'd only been inside twice before, once during my initial interview and once for my first week check-in. Both times had been routine, professional. This didn't feel routine. Raymond stood behind his desk when I knocked on the door frame. He was a big man, the kind of presence that filled a room even when he wasn't trying. Completely bald with a thick salt and pepper beard that made his steel blue eyes look even more intense. His ranger uniform was perfectly pressed, every insignia and badge positioned exactly where regulation demanded. "Close the door behind you." I did as instructed and took the chair across from his desk without being asked. The office was exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd spent 30 years working his way up through the ranks. Commendations on the walls, photographs of him with various officials, a bookshelf filled with policy manuals and forestry guides. Everything organized and purposeful. Raymond didn't sit down. Instead, he picked up a manila folder from his desk and opened it, scanning whatever was inside. The silence stretched long enough that I started wondering if I was supposed to say something first. But my gut told me to keep quiet and let him lead. "Alfred filed a report about your conduct yesterday evening." The words hit me like cold water. A report? About my conduct? I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my mind was already racing. What could Alfred have possibly written? We'd completed the patrol, returned to the station, filed the logs. Everything had been by the book except for... "He indicates you showed poor judgment during a routine patrol situation. Specifically, that you wanted to abandon protocol and investigate what turned out to be nothing more than shadows and poor lighting conditions." There it was. Alfred had filed a report, but he twisted what actually happened. Made it sound like I'd been seeing things, like I'd wanted to chase shadows instead of following proper procedure. The careful way Raymond was phrasing it told me Alfred had been very deliberate about how he'd described the incident. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion about what we encountered." "There's no confusion, Johnston." Raymond's voice cut through my words like a blade. "Alfred has 18 years of experience in these woods. You have 3 weeks. When he tells me that a rookie ranger wanted to waste time and resources investigating nothing, I believe him." The dismissal in his tone stung, but what bothered me more was how quickly he'd shut down any attempt at explanation, like he'd already decided what version of events he was going to accept before I'd even walked into the room. "I understand that, sir, but what we saw wasn't shadows or poor lighting. There was something..." "Stop right there." Raymond closed the folder and finally sat down, leaning back in his chair. His eyes never left mine, and I could feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more menacing. "Let me tell you something about working in the forest, Johnston, especially at night. The mind plays tricks, Shadows move in ways that don't make sense. Trees look like people. Rocks look like animals. Wind sounds like voices. It happens to everyone, even experienced rangers. He was giving me an out, a way to agree with his version of events and make this whole conversation go away. But the thing we'd seen hadn't been a shadow or a trick of the light. It had been real, solid, massive, and Alfred's reaction had been immediate and visceral, like he'd recognized exactly what he was looking at. "I know what I saw, sir." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Raymond's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, something that made my skin crawl. "No, you don't." His voice was barely above a whisper now. "Because if you did know what you saw, you'd understand why it's important to keep your mouth shut about it." The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. This wasn't professional guidance anymore. This was something else entirely. A warning, maybe, or a threat. Your job as a ranger is to protect the public and preserve the forest. Sometimes that means responding to emergencies. Sometimes it means enforcing regulations. And sometimes it means knowing when to mind your own business and follow your partner's lead. Raymond opened a desk drawer and pulled out a different folder, this one thicker than the first. He set it on the desk between us, but didn't open it. Alfred is one of the best rangers I've ever worked with. He knows these woods better than anyone, and he's got good instincts about when something is worth pursuing and when it's better left alone. You'd do well to listen to him. The way he emphasized "better left alone" made it clear we weren't just talking about general ranger duties anymore. This was about the figure in the road, about Alfred's immediate decision to turn around and leave, about the false report he'd radioed in afterward. "I need to know that you understand what I'm telling you, Johnston." I met his eyes and tried to read what was really happening here. Raymond Santiago had been chief for over a decade. He'd built a reputation for running a tight operation, for maintaining order and discipline. But this conversation felt like it was about something much bigger than a rookie ranger questioning his partner's judgment. "I understand that you want me to follow Alfred's lead. That's part of it." Raymond leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. "The other part is that I need to know you're not going to waste my time with reports about things that don't exist. This department responds to actual emergencies, lost hikers, injured campers, illegal hunting, real problems that require real solutions." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "We don't chase shadows. We don't investigate every strange noise or unusual sight that might or might not be something worth worrying about. And we definitely don't file reports about encounters with things that can't be explained or verified." The message was crystal clear. Whatever we'd seen on Timber Ridge Road was off limits, not just for discussion, but for any kind of official acknowledgement. Raymond was telling me that certain things didn't get reported, didn't get investigated, didn't get talked about. Do I make myself clear? "Yes, sir." "Good." Raymond closed both folders and slid them into his desk drawer. "Alfred speaks highly of your potential as a ranger. Don't make him regret recommending you for this position." Alfred had recommended me? That was news. During my interview process, I'd been told that my application had been reviewed by multiple senior staff members, but nobody had mentioned specific recommendations. The fact that Alfred had vouched for me before we'd even met added another layer to whatever was happening here. "You can go." I stood up and headed for the door, but Raymond's voice stopped me before I could leave. "Johnston, one more thing." I turned back to face him. "The woods can be dangerous, especially for someone who doesn't know them well. Stick close to your partner. Follow his lead. And remember that sometimes the best way to handle a situation is to walk away from it." I nodded and left his office, closing the door behind me. The main floor of the station buzzed with normal activity. Rangers checking equipment, reviewing patrol schedules, filing reports. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 15 minutes earlier, but something fundamental had changed. Walking back to my desk, I tried to process what had just happened. Raymond had essentially told me that certain encounters weren't supposed to be reported or investigated, that there were things in the forest that were better left alone, and that my job security depended on accepting that reality without question. But the most unsettling part wasn't what he'd said. It was how he'd said it. Like he was speaking from experience. Like he'd had this exact conversation before, with other rangers who'd seen things they weren't supposed to see. I spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on routine paperwork, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure in the road and Raymond's ominous warnings. Every time another ranger walked past my desk, I wondered if they'd had similar encounters. If they'd been called into the chief's office and given the same speech about minding their own business and following their partner's lead. Around noon, I was reviewing trail maintenance schedules when I felt someone approach my desk. I looked up to find Alfred standing there, his expression unreadable. "How'd your meeting with Santiago go?" The question was casual enough, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he already knew the answer, or at least knew what kind of conversation we'd had. Fine, just routine feedback about following proper protocols. Alfred nodded slowly like he was evaluating my response. Good. Raymond's a fair chief, but he expects his rangers to understand the bigger picture. The bigger picture. Another vague reference to something beyond normal ranger duties. I was starting to feel like everyone around me was speaking in code, referencing shared knowledge that I wasn't privy to. "Listen, Bryce." Alfred glanced around the office, making sure nobody was within earshot. "You got plans tomorrow night after shift?" "Nothing specific. Why?" "Meet me at Murphy's bar around 8. There's something I need to tell you, something important." Murphy's bar was a local place about 10 minutes from the station, the kind of establishment where off-duty rangers and other Forest Service employees went to unwind. I'd been there once since starting the job just to get a feel for the local scene. What kind of something? Alfred's expression grew more serious. The kind that's better discussed away from here, away from official channels. He was talking about the figure again. Had to be. This was his way of addressing what had really happened on Timber Ridge Road, away from Santiago's oversight and the official reporting structure. "Okay, 8 o'clock at Murphy's." "Good." Alfred started to walk away, then turned back. "And Bryce? Don't mention this to anyone else. Not Santiago, not the other rangers. Nobody." I watched him return to his desk and tried to make sense of what was happening. First, Raymond had essentially threatened me to keep quiet about what we'd encountered. Now Alfred was arranging a secret meeting to discuss something important. The two conversations felt connected, but I couldn't figure out how they fit together. The rest of the day dragged by with excruciating slowness. Every routine task felt meaningless compared to the questions burning in my mind. What was Alfred planning to tell me? Why did it have to be discussed in secret? And what exactly had Raymond meant when he'd talked about things that were better left alone? By the time my shift ended, I was wound tight with anticipation and anxiety. The drive home felt longer than usual, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary, like I was being followed, even though I knew that was paranoid thinking. My apartment was a small one-bedroom place about 20 minutes from the station, basic but comfortable enough for someone just starting out. I'd moved there specifically for the ranger job, leaving behind a desk position with the state environmental agency that had been slowly crushing my soul with bureaucracy and meaningless paperwork. I heated up leftover pizza and tried to watch television, but concentration was impossible. My mind kept cycling through the day's events, trying to find patterns or explanations that made sense. Alfred's behavior during the encounter, Raymond's veiled threats, the secret meeting tomorrow night. It all felt connected to something much larger than a simple patrol incident. Around 10 o'clock, I gave up on television and went to bed, hoping that sleep would provide some relief from the endless speculation. But lying in the dark only made things worse. Every small sound from outside made me tense up. Every shadow that moved across the ceiling from passing headlights reminded me of the massive figure standing motionless in the road. I kept thinking about Alfred's reaction when he'd seen it, the immediate recognition in his eyes, like he'd encountered something similar before, the way he'd ordered me to turn around without any hesitation or discussion. And then the false radio report, covering up what had actually happened. How many other encounters had been covered up? How many other rangers had seen things they weren't supposed to report? And what exactly was lurking in the forest that required such elaborate secrecy? The questions multiplied in the darkness, each one leading to 3 more. I tried counting sheep, tried focusing on my breathing, tried every relaxation technique I could remember. Nothing worked. My mind was too wired, too full of unanswered questions and half-formed theories. Around midnight, I got up and made myself a cup of tea, hoping the ritual would calm my nerves. Standing in the kitchen, looking out at the dark trees beyond my apartment complex, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, which was ridiculous, of course. I was miles from the forest, surrounded by other buildings and streetlights, but the feeling persisted, like invisible eyes were tracking my movements, studying me from somewhere beyond the reach of artificial light. I closed the blinds and returned to bed, but sleep remained elusive. When I finally drifted off sometime after 2 in the morning, my dreams were filled with massive figures standing in dark roads, their misshapen heads tilted at impossible angles, and behind them, in the deeper shadows between the trees, other shapes moved with patient, predatory grace. I woke up several times throughout the night, each time with the distinct impression that something had been calling my name from outside. But when I listened carefully, all I could hear was the normal sounds of wind and distant traffic. By morning, I felt like I'd barely slept at all. My eyes were gritty and my head ached from too much thinking and not enough rest. But at least the long night was over, and tonight I'd finally get some answers. Whatever Alfred had to tell me at Murphy's bar, it had to be better than the endless speculation and unanswered questions that were driving me slowly insane. Even if the truth turned out to be more disturbing than I'd imagined, at least I'd know what I was dealing with. I just hoped I was ready for whatever he was planning to reveal. I pulled into Murphy's bar parking lot just after 8, gravel crunching under my tires as I found a spot near the back. The place looked exactly like what you'd expect from a dive bar on the outskirts of town. Weathered wooden siding, neon beer signs flickering in grimy windows, and the kind of atmosphere that suggested most conversations here were meant to stay private. Walking through the front door, I let my eyes adjust to the dim lighting. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hung in the air despite the smoking ban, probably soaked into the wood paneling after decades of use. A few locals sat at the bar nursing drinks and watching a baseball game on the mounted television, their voices a low murmur that mixed with the jukebox playing some old country song I didn't recognize. I spotted Alfred immediately. He sat in the far corner booth, his back to the wall with a clear view of both the entrance and the rest of the bar. Classic positioning for someone who didn't want to be surprised or overheard. Even in civilian clothes, a faded flannel shirt and worn jeans, he still carried himself with that ranger alertness, though something about his posture seemed different tonight. As I approached his table, I noticed the glass in front of him. Whiskey, from the amber color, and definitely not his first based on how he was nursing it. Alfred wasn't much of a drinker during our patrols together. He'd mentioned once that he preferred to keep his head clear when dealing with the unpredictable nature of forest work. Seeing him here, deliberately working his way through what looked like expensive bourbon, told me this conversation was going to be heavier than I'd anticipated. Bryce. He looked up as I slid into the booth across from him. Thanks for coming. Of course. I flagged down the waitress and ordered a beer, more to have something to do with my hands than because I wanted alcohol. You sounded like this was important. Alfred nodded, his fingers tightening around his glass. That's when I really got a good look at his face. The fluorescent light above our booth was harsh and unflattering, but it couldn't hide what I was seeing. Fear. Not the healthy caution that came with years of dealing with dangerous wildlife or unpredictable weather conditions. This was something deeper, more personal. The kind of fear that comes from knowing exactly what you're afraid of and having good reason to be afraid of it. It is important. He took another sip of whiskey, grimaced slightly, then set the glass down with deliberate care. What we saw out there the other night, that wasn't the first time. I felt my stomach tighten. Part of me had suspected as much from his reaction, but hearing him confirm it made everything more real. When? 7 years ago. Alfred's voice dropped lower, forcing me to lean forward to catch his words over the ambient noise of the bar. I had a different partner then, Miles Allen. Good man, experienced ranger, been on the job for about 15 years at that point. The waitress brought my beer, and I took a long pull while Alfred gathered his thoughts. I could see him working through whatever he was about to tell me, his eyes focused on something beyond the grimy window beside our booth. We were doing a night patrol, same route we took the other evening, same section of Forest Road where we encountered that thing. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Miles was driving that night. I was in the passenger seat doing radio checks when he suddenly hit the brakes. Alfred's hand moved to his glass again, but he didn't pick it up, just traced the rim with one finger while he continued. There it was, standing right in the middle of the road. Same spot, near as I could tell. Just like what we saw with you. Same creature? Had to be. Alfred's eyes met mine, and I saw something there that made my chest tighten. Not just fear, but certainty. The kind of absolute knowledge that comes from experiencing something so distinctive, so impossible, that there's no chance of mistaking it for anything else. 8 feet tall, arms too long for any human being, head tilted at that unnatural angle. But this time... He trailed off, reaching for his whiskey and downing what remained in one swallow. I waited, knowing better than to push. Alfred had always been methodical in his explanations during our patrols, taking time to make sure he communicated clearly. But this felt different. This felt like a man trying to find words for something that shouldn't exist. This time it moved, he finally continued. Not away from us like you might expect. Toward us. Alongside the vehicle. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Alongside? Miles was backing up, trying to turn around, same as I did with you. But this thing, it kept pace with us, walking parallel to the driver's side, maybe 20 feet out in the trees, just matching our speed perfectly like it was escorting us. Alfred signaled the waitress for another whiskey. I noticed his hand wasn't entirely steady when he raised it. Miles had a spotlight mounted on his side of the vehicle. Big halogen beam, the kind we use for wildlife counts. He hit the switch and swept it across the trees, trying to get a better look. The waitress brought Alfred's drink, and he immediately took a sip before continuing. That's when we both got a clear view of it. And Bryce, he looked directly at me, his voice dropping even lower. What we saw wasn't human, wasn't anything that should exist. I found myself leaning forward despite every instinct telling me I didn't want to hear this. What did it look like? The face was all wrong, twisted, like someone had taken human features and rearranged them without understanding how they were supposed to fit together. Eyes too far apart, mouth that stretched too wide, nose that looked like it had been broken and healed crooked multiple times. Alfred's fingers tightened around his glass. But the worst part was the arms. They hung down past its knees, ending in hands that were more like claws. Long fingers with joints that bent in ways that shouldn't be possible. He paused to take another drink, and I used the break to process what he was telling me. The figure I'd seen had been disturbing enough in the brief glimpse I'd gotten, but Alfred was describing something far more detailed and far more terrifying. Miles was fascinated by it. Alfred continued. You know how some people get around dangerous wildlife? That mix of fear and curiosity that makes them want to get closer instead of backing away? That was Miles. He kept the spotlight trained on it, following its movement through the trees. What happened then? It stopped. Alfred's voice took on a hollow quality that made me think he was reliving the memory rather than just recounting it. Just came to a complete halt, maybe 50 yards ahead of us, right at the edge of the spotlight beam. Miles stopped the vehicle too, and we both sat there watching it. Alfred stared into his whiskey glass like he might find answers there. Then it turned toward us, looked right at the vehicle, right at that spotlight beam. And I swear, Bryce, it was looking directly at Miles, like it knew exactly who was behind that light. I felt my mouth go dry. What did you do? I told Miles we needed to leave. Right then, no discussion. Just get the hell out of there and report it when we got back to the station. Alfred's laugh was bitter and humorless. But Miles wouldn't listen. Said we had a responsibility to investigate, that whatever this thing was, it might pose a threat to hikers or campers in the area. The way Alfred said it made my stomach drop. I could already sense where this story was heading, and I didn't like it. He wanted to follow it. Against my better judgment, yes. Miles was senior to me then, had more experience, more authority. When he made the call to pursue, I couldn't override him. Alfred's voice carried the weight of 7 years of regret. We got out of the vehicle and followed it into the trees. I took another long pull of my beer, trying to steady my nerves for whatever was coming next. How far did you go? Maybe a quarter mile. The thing moved through the forest like it owned every inch of it, never stumbling over roots or getting caught on branches, just gliding between the trees with that unnatural gait, always staying just at the edge of our flashlight range. Alfred's eyes had gone distant again. Miles was documenting everything, taking photos with his camera, making notes about the creature's behavior and movement patterns, treating it like a wildlife observation instead of what? Instead of what it actually was. Alfred met my eyes again, and the fear I saw there was mixed with something else now. Guilt. Deep, consuming guilt that had clearly been eating at him for years. A predator. And we were walking right into its territory. The jukebox had switched to a different song, something slower and more melancholy that seemed to match the mood at our table. I found myself glancing around the bar, noting the other patrons and their conversations, anything to avoid thinking too hard about what Alfred was describing. It happened fast, Alfred continued. One moment Miles was ahead of me, following the creature through a dense section of undergrowth. The next moment I heard him scream. I felt my chest tighten. It attacked him. I never saw the actual attack. By the time I pushed through the brush to where Miles had been, there was just evidence. Broken branches, disturbed ground, his camera lying in the dirt with the lens cracked. Alfred's voice became even quieter. And blood. Not a lot, but enough to know something violent had happened. What about Miles? Gone. Him and the creature, both just gone. Like they'd vanished into thin air. Alfred finished his second whiskey and set the glass down with a soft clink. I called out for him, searched the immediate area with my flashlight. But there was nothing. No trail to follow, no sounds, no indication of which direction they'd gone. I tried to imagine being alone in those dark woods, knowing something inhuman had just taken my partner, and felt a chill run down my spine. What did you do? What I should have done from the beginning. Got the hell out of there and called for backup. Alfred's expression was grim. Search and rescue teams combed that area for 3 days, brought in tracking dogs, helicopter support, volunteers from town. We covered every square mile within a 5-mile radius of where Miles disappeared. Did you find anything? Nothing. No trace of Miles, no sign of the creature, no evidence that anything unusual had happened in those woods at all. Alfred's hands clenched into fists on the table. The official report listed Miles as missing, presumed dead due to unknown circumstances. Case was closed after 6 months with no leads. I stared at Alfred, trying to process the implications of what he was telling me. But you know what really happened. I know that thing took him. I know Miles is dead because I let him follow that creature into the woods instead of forcing him to leave when we had the chance. The guilt in Alfred's voice was painful to hear, and I know that 7 years later it's still out there. The weight of his confession settled between us like a physical presence. I understood now why Alfred had reacted so strongly to our encounter, why he'd been so insistent that we leave immediately. He'd seen what that thing was capable of, had lost his partner to it, and had been carrying that knowledge alone for 7 years. Why didn't you tell anyone about what you really saw? Who would have believed me? A story about an 8-foot-tall creature that walks upright and hunts in the forest. Alfred's laugh was bitter. Santiago would have had me committed for psychological evaluation. The other rangers would have thought I'd lost my mind from trauma and guilt. That made sense. I thought about my own brief encounter with Santiago, his veiled threats about keeping quiet and minding my own business. So you've been dealing with this alone all this time. Until now. Alfred looked at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Bryce, I need to go back there. I felt my stomach drop. Back where? To the woods, to the place where Miles disappeared. Alfred's voice carried a determination that worried me more than his fear had. I need to know what happened to him. I need to find out if there's anything left, any evidence, any way to get closure after all these years. The request hung in the air between us, and I found myself staring at Alfred's face, trying to read his intentions. This wasn't just about closure, I realized. This was about guilt. 7 years of carrying the weight of his partner's death, of knowing he could have prevented it if he'd been more forceful about leaving when they first encountered the creature. Alfred, that's incredibly dangerous. If this thing killed Miles, it might kill me too. I know that. Alfred's voice was steady, but I could see the fear still lurking in his eyes. But I can't live with not knowing anymore. I can't spend the rest of my career walking through those woods knowing Miles is out there somewhere, and I never tried to find him. I took a long drink of my beer, buying time to think. Everything rational in my mind was screaming that this was a terrible idea. Going into the woods to deliberately seek out something that had already killed one experienced ranger was beyond reckless. It was suicidal. But looking at Alfred's face, seeing the pain and guilt that had been eating at him for 7 years, I understood why he felt he had no choice. This wasn't about being a hero or solving a mystery. This was about a man who couldn't live with himself anymore unless he tried to make things right. When? I heard myself ask, even though part of me couldn't believe I was considering this. Tomorrow night. Same time as our regular patrol, so no one will question why we're out there. Alfred's eyes met mine, and I saw something like hope mixed with the fear and determination. I know it's a lot to ask, Bryce. I know you barely know me, and this isn't your responsibility. But I can't do this alone. I stared at him for a long moment, weighing the insanity of what he was proposing against the very real pain I could see in his expression. Alfred had been carrying this burden for 7 years, had watched his partner disappear, and been unable to do anything about it. The guilt was destroying him from the inside out. You really think we can find something after all this time? I don't know. Maybe. But I have to try. Alfred's voice carried a quiet desperation that made my chest ache. Miles deserves better than just being listed as missing. His family deserves to know what happened to him, and I deserve to face whatever's out there instead of running from it again. I thought about my own encounter with the creature. the way it had simply vanished when Alfred turned the vehicle around. Had it been watching us? Had it recognized Alfred from their previous encounter? The questions had been gnawing at me for days, and I realized that part of me needed answers too. "All right," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "I'll help you." The relief that washed over Alfred's face was immediate and profound. For the first time since I'd sat down, some of the tension left his shoulders, and I caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before Miles disappeared. "Thank you, Bryce. I know this isn't easy and I know it's dangerous, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." He reached across the table and gripped my shoulder briefly. "We'll be careful. We'll go in prepared. And if things go wrong, we'll get out fast." I nodded, though I wondered how prepared anyone could be for something like what Alfred had described. "What's the plan?" "Same route as our regular patrol. When we reach the area where we encountered it, we'll park and go in on foot. I remember the general direction Miles and I took that night. If there's anything left to find, it'll be in that area." The practical side of my mind was already working through the logistics. Equipment, standard gear plus extra flashlights, first aid kit, emergency radio. Alfred's voice had taken on a more professional tone, like he was planning a routine search and rescue operation instead of a potentially deadly encounter with something that shouldn't exist. "We'll stay in radio contact with each other, maintain visual contact as much as possible, and establish a clear exit strategy before we go in." It sounded reasonable, almost routine, when he laid it out like that. But I knew we were both avoiding the obvious question. What would we do if we actually encountered the creature again? Alfred had seen what it was capable of. If it had killed Miles, what chance would the two of us have against it? "Alfred," I said carefully, "what if we find it instead of finding Miles?" His expression darkened, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like anticipation mixed with the fear. "Then maybe I'll finally get the chance to face what I should have faced 7 years ago." The weight of his words settled over our table, and I realized that this wasn't just about finding Miles or getting closure. This was about Alfred's need to confront his own guilt and fear, even if it killed him. He'd been running from this for 7 years, and he was tired of running. I looked into his eyes, seeing the deep guilt that had been weighing on him all this time. The pain of losing his partner, and the knowledge that he might have been able to prevent it. Despite every rational part of my mind screaming that this was insane, I found myself nodding. We drove in complete silence to the location where Alfred's world had collapsed 7 years ago. I kept my hand steady on the steering wheel, but my mind wouldn't stop racing through everything that could go wrong. Alfred sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the dark forest rushing past us, his jaw set in that determined way that told me he'd made peace with whatever was about to happen. The radio crackled occasionally with routine check-ins from other units, but Alfred didn't respond to any of them. We were officially off duty, technically not even supposed to be out here, but that felt like the least of our problems right now. I'd called in sick for my regular shift, and Alfred had done the same. Santiago would probably figure out what we were up to eventually, but by then it would be too late to stop us. "Turn here," Alfred said quietly as we approached a narrow dirt access road I'd never noticed before. The headlights swept across a rusty metal gate that hung open, probably hadn't been closed in years. "This leads to the old logging area. We can park about half a mile in." I guided the truck down the bumpy path, feeling every pothole and rut through the steering wheel. The trees pressed in closer on both sides, branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers trying to get inside. Alfred had been right about one thing. This place felt different at night. During the day, it was just forest. Now it felt alive, watching, waiting for something. "Stop here," Alfred said when we reached a small clearing where the road widened slightly. I pulled over and killed the engine, but left the headlights on for a few more seconds to get our bearings. Alfred was already checking his gear, flashlight, radio, first aid kit, the works. He'd even brought rope and a camera, though I wasn't sure what he planned to document. The silence hit us as soon as I turned off the lights. Not the peaceful quiet you might expect in the woods, but something heavier. Like the forest was holding its breath. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, which probably wasn't a good sign for what we were about to attempt. "You sure about this?" I asked one more time, giving Alfred a final chance to back out. Part of me hoped he'd change his mind, that we could drive back to town and pretend this conversation never happened. Alfred looked at me with those tired eyes that had been haunted for 7 years. "I've been sure about this since the night Miles disappeared. I just needed someone else to help me find the courage." We got out of the truck and Alfred immediately started walking toward the tree line, moving with the confidence of someone who'd replayed this route in his mind thousands of times. I followed, my flashlight beam dancing across the uneven ground as we left the safety of the clearing behind. The undergrowth was thicker than I'd expected. Branches caught at our clothes and roots tried to trip us with every step. Alfred moved through it like he knew exactly where he was going, following some invisible path that only made sense to him. I had to trust that he remembered the way, because everything looked the same to me. Just endless trees and shadows that seemed to shift every time I wasn't looking directly at them. "Miles and I came through here," Alfred said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of our footsteps crunching through dead leaves. He was so excited about the whole thing. Kept talking about how this could be the discovery of the century, how we'd be famous for documenting something completely unknown to science. I could hear the pain in his voice, the guilt that had been eating at him for all these years. Miles had died because he'd been curious, because he'd wanted to investigate instead of running, and Alfred had been carrying the weight of that decision ever since, wondering if he could have done something different. "He was a good ranger," Alfred continued, pushing aside a low-hanging branch. "Better than me in a lot of ways, more thorough, more dedicated. He actually cared about protecting people, not just following protocols." We kept walking deeper into the forest than I'd ever been before. The trees grew taller and older, their trunks thick enough that it would take 3 people holding hands to wrap around them. Some of them had to be hundreds of years old, which meant they'd been here long before the first settlers arrived, long before anyone had tried to map or understand this place. Alfred stopped suddenly, holding up his hand for silence. I froze, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. At first, there was nothing, just the usual forest sounds. Wind through leaves, small animals moving through the brush, the distant hoot of an owl. Then I heard it too, a faint rustling that didn't quite match the rhythm of the wind. "Probably just a deer," I whispered. But Alfred shook his head. "Deer don't move like that," he said, his voice tense. "Too deliberate, too careful." We stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, listening to the forest around us. The rustling stopped, and gradually the normal sounds returned. Alfred relaxed slightly and started walking again, but I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder. The terrain began to change as we went deeper. The ground became more uneven, with rocky outcroppings and small ravines that forced us to detour around them. Alfred navigated through it all with the ease of someone who'd been here before, but I was starting to understand why the search teams had never found any trace of Miles. This wasn't the kind of place where you stumbled across evidence by accident. "How much further?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. "Not far," Alfred replied. "Maybe another 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like the longest of my life. Every shadow could have been hiding something. Every sound could have been a warning that we were walking into danger. I kept thinking about Santiago's threats, about the way he'd made it clear that some things were supposed to stay hidden. What if we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed? But Alfred needed this. I could see it in the way he moved, the way his shoulders had straightened as we got closer to our destination. For 7 years, he'd been carrying the weight of leaving his partner behind. of not knowing what had happened in those final moments. Maybe finding Miles wouldn't bring him peace, but at least it would give him answers. The forest began to thin slightly as we approached what looked like a natural clearing. Alfred slowed his pace, moving more carefully now, and I could see the tension in his posture. This was it. This was where everything had gone wrong 7 years ago. "There," Alfred said, pointing ahead with his flashlight. "That's where we lost the trail. Miles went through those trees and never came back out." I followed his beam and saw a gap between two massive oak trees, like a doorway leading into deeper darkness. The undergrowth was different here, more sparse, as if something had been keeping it from growing back properly. Alfred took a deep breath and started forward again, but his steps were slower now, more hesitant. We pushed through the gap between the oaks and found ourselves in a small grove where the canopy opened up enough to let in patches of moonlight. Alfred swept his flashlight back and forth, searching for something specific, and I did the same. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just more trees, more shadows, more of the same forest we'd been walking through. Then Alfred stopped moving entirely. His flashlight beam had found something, and he stood frozen, staring up at one of the larger oak trees. I followed his gaze and felt my blood turn to ice. There, hanging from a thick branch about 12 feet off the ground, was a body, or what was left of one. 7 years of weather and wildlife had reduced it to little more than bones held together by scraps of fabric that might once have been a ranger uniform. The skeleton hung at an odd angle, suspended by what looked like rope or wire around the ribcage, swaying slightly in the night breeze. Alfred approached slowly, almost reverently, his flashlight never wavering from the remains. "Miles," he whispered, and I heard 7 years of guilt and grief in that single word. I stayed back, giving Alfred space to process what we'd found, but my mind was racing. This wasn't just a body. This was a message. Someone or something had put Miles here deliberately, had wanted him to be found eventually. But why wait 7 years? And why hang him like some kind of macabre scarecrow? Alfred reached the base of the tree and looked up at his former partner's remains. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I'm so sorry I left you here. I should have come back sooner. I should have kept looking." That's when I noticed the piece of paper pinned to the chest cavity, held in place by what looked like a long thorn or piece of bone. It had somehow survived the weather, though it was yellowed and faded. I moved closer, adding my flashlight beam to Alfred's, and together we read the message written in dark ink that might once have been red. "Keep your eyes on the road." The same words from Alfred's story. The same warning that had been carved into the tree where the original ranger had found his partner's body decades ago. Whatever was out here, it had a sense of continuity, a pattern it liked to follow, and now we were part of that pattern. Alfred reached up toward the note, probably wanting to preserve it as evidence, but I was already turning around, some instinct telling me we weren't alone anymore. That's when I heard it. The sharp crack of a branch breaking under tremendous weight coming from somewhere behind us in the darkness. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows between the trees, and saw it emerging from the forest like something out of a nightmare. The creature was even more massive than I'd imagined from our brief encounter on the road, at least 8 feet tall and built like it could tear a person in half without effort. But it was the face that made my blood freeze, a grotesque parody of human features, with eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's, and a mouth that was too wide, filled with teeth that were too sharp. The fingers weren't fingers at all, but something closer to talons, long and curved and designed for gripping and tearing. They flexed as the creature stepped fully into our clearing, moving with a fluid grace that no creature that size should have possessed. A chill ran down my spine as I realized we'd walked directly into its territory, and now it was standing between us and the way we'd come. I screamed Alfred's name, the word ripping from my throat as the creature closed the distance between us. Alfred didn't move. He stood there beneath Miles's hanging remains like he was rooted to the spot, his flashlight beam wavering as his hand trembled. The creature had positioned itself perfectly, cutting off our escape route, and now it was moving toward Alfred with that fluid, impossible grace. "Alfred, run!" I shouted again, but my voice seemed to bounce off him without effect. He was staring up at the creature, and I realized with growing horror that he wasn't frozen with fear. He was accepting what was about to happen. 7 years of guilt had brought him to this moment, and some part of him believed he deserved whatever came next. The creature moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move. 1 second, it was 20 feet away. The next, it was reaching for Alfred with those talon-like fingers. I watched Alfred's flashlight fall from his hand and hit the ground, the beam spinning wildly before settling on a patch of dead leaves. The light illuminated the creature's legs as it grabbed Alfred by the shoulders, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing at all. The sound that came next would haunt me for the rest of my life. A sharp crack, like a thick branch snapping in half, followed by Alfred's body going completely limp. His head lolled at an angle that heads weren't supposed to bend, and I knew with absolute certainty that my partner was dead. The creature had snapped his neck as easily as breaking a pencil. I didn't make a conscious decision to run. My body just started moving, crashing through the undergrowth in the opposite direction from where we'd entered the grove. Branches whipped across my face and tore at my uniform, but I barely felt them. Behind me, I could hear the creature moving, and worse than that, I could hear something being dragged across the forest floor. Alfred's body. The thing was taking him, just like it had taken Miles 7 years ago. My lungs were already burning, but I pushed harder, stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness. I'd dropped my flashlight when I started running, and now I was navigating by moonlight in pure desperation. Every shadow looked like the creature, every sound like those talons scraping against bark. I kept expecting to feel those massive hands grab me from behind, to hear that same sickening crack as my own neck snapped. The forest seemed to stretch on forever. I'd lost all sense of direction, crashing through trees and undergrowth without any idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. My uniform jacket caught on a low branch and tore, but I didn't slow down. I could taste blood in my mouth from where a branch had caught my lip, and something warm was running down my cheek from a cut above my eyebrow. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit continued. Not the heavy footfalls I might have expected from something that size, but a different kind of movement. Branches bending and snapping back, leaves rustling in patterns that didn't match the wind. The creature was following me, and it was bringing Alfred's body with it. I could hear the dead weight being dragged over rocks and through brush, a sound that made my stomach turn. I tried to remember the route we'd taken to reach the grove, but panic had scrambled my memory. Everything looked the same in the darkness, trees and more trees, rocks and fallen logs that all blended together into an endless maze. I was lost, running blind through a forest that suddenly felt infinite, with a nightmare creature hunting me through the shadows. My foot caught on something, a root or a rock, and I went down hard. Pain shot through my knee as it hit the ground, and for a terrifying moment I thought I'd twisted it badly enough that I wouldn't be able to keep running. I scrambled back to my feet, testing my weight on the leg. It hurt, but it held. Behind me, the sounds were getting closer. That's when I saw it. A glint of metal through the trees, reflecting what little moonlight filtered through the canopy. Our patrol vehicle. I'd somehow managed to circle back toward the logging area where we'd parked. Relief flooded through me, giving me a second wind I didn't know I had left. I sprinted toward the truck, crashing through the last line of trees and stumbling into the small clearing. The keys. Where were the keys? I patted down my pockets frantically. my hands shaking so badly I could barely feel what I was touching. Alfred had been driving when we came out here, but I'd driven us to the access road. The keys had to be in my pocket somewhere. My fingers finally closed around the familiar weight of the keyring, and I yanked them out so hard that several keys went flying. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands slick with sweat and blood from the cuts on my face. The key slipped in my grip twice before I managed to get it into the lock. Behind me, I could hear the creature emerging from the tree line. I didn't turn around to look. I couldn't. If I saw it again, saw what it was dragging behind it, I might freeze up completely. The engine turned over on the second try, and I'd never been so grateful to hear the rumble of an internal combustion engine. I threw the truck into reverse and backed out of the clearing so fast that I nearly clipped a tree. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving at the edge of the forest, but I forced myself not to focus on it. I couldn't afford to see what the creature had done to Alfred. I spun the wheel and shifted into drive, flooring the accelerator as soon as the truck was pointed toward the access road. The vehicle bounced and lurched over the rough terrain, but I didn't slow down. Rocks and branches scraped against the undercarriage, and at one point I hit a pothole so hard that my head nearly hit the roof, but I kept my foot pressed to the floor. The access road seemed longer on the way out than it had on the way in. Every curve, every shadow between the trees looked like it might hide another creature. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something pursuing me. But there was nothing but darkness and dust kicked up by my tires. The creature had let me go. The question was why. When I finally reached the main forest road, I didn't slow down. If anything, I drove faster, taking curves at speeds that would have gotten me fired if Santiago had seen me. The truck's headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead of me, but the forest pressed in on both sides like it was trying to swallow the road entirely. I kept the radio turned off. I couldn't handle hearing dispatch asking for status reports, couldn't face the idea of trying to explain what had happened. My hands were shaking so badly on the steering wheel that I had trouble keeping the truck in my lane. Every few minutes, a wave of nausea would hit me as I remembered the sound of Alfred's neck snapping, the sight of his body going limp in the creature's grasp. I'd left him there. I'd run away and left my partner's body with that thing, just like Alfred had left Miles 7 years ago. The guilt was already starting to eat at me, adding another layer to the horror of what I'd witnessed. The ranger station appeared ahead of me like a beacon, its parking lot lights cutting through the darkness. I pulled into the lot and sat in the truck for a long moment, engine running, trying to get my breathing under control. The building looked normal, peaceful even. Yellow light spilled from the windows, and I could see someone moving around inside. Probably Martinez pulling the night shift, doing paperwork and monitoring radio traffic. Normal ranger business, completely oblivious to the fact that something unspeakable was stalking the forest just a few miles away. I turned off the engine and tried to think about what I was going to do next. I had to report Alfred's death. But how could I explain what had really happened? Santiago had already made it clear that certain encounters weren't to be reported or investigated. If I walked in there and told the truth about the creature, about what it had done to Alfred, I'd probably end up in a psychiatric ward. Or worse, Santiago might decide I knew too much and needed to be silenced permanently. I reached for the radio handset, then stopped. The radio had been nothing but static when I tried to call for backup earlier. That could have been a coincidence, some kind of equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. But given everything else that had happened, I was starting to suspect that the static hadn't been accidental. Someone, or something, didn't want me calling for help. The smart thing to do was wait until morning. Give myself time to come up with a story that wouldn't get me committed or fired. Alfred had family somewhere, people who deserved to know what had happened to him. But they weren't going to get the truth anyway. Just like Miles's family had gotten Ailey about their son disappearing during a routine patrol. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and immediately wished I hadn't. Blood had dried on my cheek from the cut above my eyebrow, and there were scratches across my face from the branches. My uniform was torn in several places, and there were leaves and twigs stuck to my jacket. I looked like I'd been through hell, which wasn't far from the truth. Anyone who saw me would know something terrible had happened. The passenger door of the truck still hung open from where Alfred had gotten out. I reached over and pulled it shut, the sound echoing across the empty parking lot. That simple action hit me harder than I expected. Alfred would never sit in that seat again, would never point out landmarks or share stories about problem campers. He was gone, and I was the only person who knew what had really happened to him. I tried the radio one more time, turning the volume up and cycling through the channels. Nothing but static on every frequency. Either every radio tower in a 50-mile radius had simultaneously malfunctioned, or something was actively jamming the signal. Given what I'd just witnessed, I was leaning toward the latter explanation. My hands had finally stopped shaking enough for me to fish my cell phone out of my pocket. No signal. That wasn't unusual this deep in the forest, but it felt like another piece of evidence that I was being cut off from the outside world. Whatever was happening in these woods, it didn't want word getting out. I sat there in the truck for another 10 minutes watching the ranger station and trying to work up the courage to go inside. Martinez would ask questions about why I was there in the middle of the night, why I looked like I'd been in a fight, where Alfred was. I needed answers that wouldn't sound completely insane, but my mind kept circling back to the truth. The creature, the hanging corpse, the sound of Alfred's neck snapping. A movement in the tree line caught my eye, and my heart nearly stopped. For a split second, I thought I saw something tall moving between the trees, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. Just shadows and moonlight playing tricks on my exhausted mind. At least that's what I told myself. I couldn't sit in the parking lot all night. Eventually, someone would notice the truck and come out to investigate. I needed to get inside, clean myself up, and figure out what I was going to say when people started asking about Alfred. The story would have to be simple. We'd gone for a late dinner after our shift, maybe had a few drinks. Alfred had decided to drive himself home instead of riding with me. I hadn't seen him since. It wasn't a great lie, but it was better than the truth. At least it wouldn't get me locked up in a psychiatric ward. I climbed out of the truck and walked toward the station, my legs still unsteady from the adrenaline crash. The night air felt cold against the cuts on my face, and every shadow seemed to move in my peripheral vision. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature emerging from the forest, but the tree line remained dark and still. The front door of the station was unlocked, as always. We were supposed to keep it secured during night shifts, but most of the rangers ignored that policy. Who was going to break into a ranger station in the middle of nowhere? I pushed the door open and stepped inside, immediately hit by the familiar smell of coffee and old paperwork. Martinez looked up from his desk as I entered, and his expression immediately shifted from boredom to concern. He was a decent guy, maybe 10 years older than me, with a wife and 2 kids at home. He'd been working nights for the past month to pick up some extra overtime pay. "Jesus, Bryce, what happened to you?" he asked, standing up from his chair. "You look like you got mauled by a bear." I touched the cut above my eyebrow, feeling the dried blood flake away under my fingers. "Hiking accident," I said, the lie coming easier than I'd expected. "Took a tumble down a slope in the dark. Nothing serious." Martinez frowned, clearly not buying the story completely. "What are you doing here? I thought you and Alfred were off tonight." "We were. I just needed to grab something from my locker." Another lie, but Martinez nodded and sat back down. He had his own paperwork to worry about, and my personal business wasn't his problem. I walked to the back of the station where the lockers were located, mostly to get out of Martinez's line of sight. My hands were starting to shake again, as the reality of the situation hit me. Alfred was dead. In a few hours, people would start looking for him. His shift supervisor would call when he didn't show up for work. His family would get worried when he didn't come home. and I was the only person who knew what had really happened to him. The bathroom mirror showed me just how bad I looked. The cut above my eyebrow was deeper than I'd thought, and there were scratches across both cheeks from the branches. My uniform shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there were dark stains that might have been blood or just dirt. I looked like a man who'd barely escaped from something terrible. I ran cold water in the sink and tried to clean up the worst of the damage. The cuts stung when the water hit them, but I managed to wash away most of the dried blood. There wasn't much I could do about the torn uniform without a change of clothes, but at least I didn't look quite so much like an accident victim. When I came out of the bathroom, Martinez was back to his paperwork, but I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye. He knew something was wrong, but he wasn't the type to push for details. That was good. I wasn't ready to start lying to people's faces about what had happened to Alfred. I sat down at my own desk and stared at the computer screen without really seeing it. In a few hours, the sun would come up and people would start asking questions I couldn't answer honestly. Santiago would want to know where Alfred was. Other rangers would wonder why I looked like I'd been in a fight. And somewhere in the forest, that creature would be doing whatever it did with the bodies of the people it killed. The radio on Martinez's desk crackled to life, making both of us jump. It was just routine chatter from another unit, but the sudden noise in the quiet station felt like a gunshot. My nerves were completely shot, and every unexpected sound made me think the creature had somehow followed me here. I tried to focus on the computer, pulling up routine reports and pretending to work, but my mind kept drifting back to the forest. Alfred's body was out there somewhere, probably hanging from a tree branch just like Miles had been. The creature had taken him, and there was nothing I could do about it. Even if I told the truth, even if I somehow convinced people that a monster was stalking the forest, what then? More rangers would die trying to hunt it down. The clock on the wall showed 3:30 in the morning. Dawn was still hours away, but I knew I wouldn't be getting any sleep tonight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alfred's head snapping to that impossible angle, heard the sound of his body being dragged through the undergrowth. The guilt was already eating at me, just like it had eaten at Alfred for 7 years. Martinez's radio crackled again, and this time I heard my own call sign mixed in with the static. Someone was trying to reach me, but the signal was too weak and distorted to make out the words. Martinez tried to respond, but got nothing back except more static. Atmospheric interference, he said, more to himself than to me. Happens sometimes when the weather's changing. I nodded and pretended to agree, but I knew better. The radio jamming wasn't natural, and it wasn't a coincidence. Something didn't want me talking to the outside world, at least not tonight. Whatever was happening in those woods, it was bigger than just one creature killing rangers. There was a system in place, a cover-up that had been going on for years. Santiago knew. He'd all but admitted it when he'd warned me about keeping my mouth shut. And if Santiago knew, then others knew too. People in positions of authority who had decided that some secrets were worth more than human lives. I sat there at my desk, staring at the radio and listening to the static, and made a decision that would change everything. I would wait until morning to report what had happened, just like I'd planned, but I wouldn't lie about it, not completely. I would tell them that Alfred was missing, that something had happened to him in the forest, and then I would watch very carefully to see who tried to cover it up. I waited until 7 in the morning before making the call. The ranger station felt different in the early hours, quieter somehow, like the building itself was holding its breath. Martinez had gone home at 6, leaving me alone with the radio static and my rehearsed story. Raymond answered on the second ring, his voice already sharp despite the early hour. "Chief, it's Johnston. I need to report that Alfred Fowler is missing." The words came out steadier than I'd expected. I'd practiced them enough times in my head during those long hours at my desk, watching the clock tick toward what felt like a reasonable time to call. Missing how? Raymond's tone gave nothing away, but I could hear papers shuffling in the background. We were supposed to meet for dinner last night after our shift. He never showed up. I tried calling his cell, went by his apartment. No answer, no sign of him. His truck isn't there either. I kept my voice level, professional, just a concerned partner reporting standard protocol. The lie felt heavy in my mouth, but the truth would have been impossible to explain. How could I tell Raymond that I'd watched a creature snap Alfred's neck and drag his body into the woods? That I'd run like a coward while my partner died? When did you last see him? End of shift yesterday, around 5:30. He seemed fine, maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual. More paper shuffling. I could picture Raymond at his desk, probably already reaching for the forms that would make this conversation official. The thought made my stomach clench. Did he mention any personal issues, family problems, financial trouble? The questions felt routine, like Raymond had asked them before. Like this was just another missing person case that would follow a predictable pattern. I wondered how many times he'd had conversations like this. How many rangers had simply vanished without explanation. Nothing like that. Alfred's been solid since I started working with him. Professional, reliable. Right. Raymond's voice carried a note I couldn't identify. Not quite dismissal, but something close to it. Come in at 8. We'll need to file the paperwork. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there holding the phone, staring at the radio that had been crackling with that strange static all night. Whatever was happening here, Raymond knew about it. The way he'd handled my questions, the careful distance in his voice. He was already preparing to manage this situation. I drove home to shower and change clothes. The cuts on my face had scabbed over during the night, and I'd managed to come up with a story about hiking alone and taking a fall. The torn uniform was harder to explain, but I figured I could claim it happened during the same accident. My apartment felt too quiet when I walked in. I kept thinking about Alfred's guilt, the way he'd stood there under Miles's body like he was accepting judgment. 7 years of carrying that weight, and now he was dead because of it, because I'd agreed to help him go back to that place. The shower water ran pink from the dried blood in my hair. I'd missed a cut behind my ear, and it stung when the soap hit it. My hands were still shaking slightly, though not as badly as they had been during the drive back. The physical evidence of what had happened was washing down the drain, but I could still hear that sharp crack when the creature broke Alfred's neck. I got dressed in a clean uniform and drove back to the station. Raymond's office light was already on, and I could see him through the blinds, sitting at his desk with a manila folder open in front of him. The same setup as when he'd called me in about the first encounter, except this time I was the one requesting the meeting. I knocked on his door frame at exactly 8 o'clock. Come in. Close the door. Raymond didn't look up from the folder as I took the same chair I'd sat in 2 days ago. The déjà vu was unsettling, like I was trapped in some kind of loop where rangers disappeared and chiefs asked careful questions. So, Raymond said, finally meeting my eyes, Alfred Fowler. He said the name like he was testing it, seeing how it sounded. The folder in front of him was thick, too thick for something he'd just started this morning. My chest tightened as I realized he'd been expecting this conversation. Yes, sir. Like I said on the phone, he didn't show up last night. I'm concerned something might have happened to him. Raymond leaned back in his chair, studying my face. His eyes lingered on the cuts, the bandage I'd put over the deeper one above my eyebrow. I could see him cataloging the damage, probably wondering if it was connected to Alfred's disappearance. Interesting thing, Johnston. I got a call yesterday afternoon from Alfred. Said he was putting in his resignation, effective immediately. Personal reasons. Family emergency back east. The words hit me like cold water. I stared at Raymond, trying to process what he'd just said. Alfred had been with me yesterday afternoon. We'd been planning our trip to the woods, going over the route, discussing what equipment to bring. There was no family emergency, no resignation. That's impossible, I said. I was with Alfred yesterday afternoon. We were working on patrol schedules for next week. Raymond opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He turned it around so I could see it. A resignation letter on official letterhead, dated yesterday, signed in what looked like Alfred's handwriting. Says here he got a call about his sister's illness. Had to leave immediately to help with care arrangements. Didn't have time for proper notice, but he'll forward his address once he gets settled. I read the letter twice, my mind racing. The handwriting did look like Alfred's, though something about it seemed off. The spacing was wrong, maybe, or the pressure of the pen, like someone had been copying his signature rather than writing naturally. Chief, this doesn't make sense. Alfred never mentioned a sister to me, and he was planning to work tonight's shift. We had assignments lined up for the rest of the week. Raymond took the letter back and slid it into the folder. When he looked at me again, his expression had hardened into something I recognized from our previous meeting. The look that said I was about to be told things I didn't want to hear. Johnston, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Did you and Alfred go anywhere together last night? Anywhere off the books? The question hung in the air between us. I could feel the weight of it, the implication that Raymond already knew more than he was letting on. My mouth went dry as I considered my options. Tell him the truth and sound insane, or stick to my story and hope he couldn't prove otherwise. No, sir. Like I said, we were supposed to meet for dinner, but he never showed. Raymond nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out another folder, this one even thicker than the first. When he opened it, I could see photographs clipped to the inside cover. Crime scene photos, by the look of them. See, the thing is, we found Alfred's truck this morning, abandoned on Forest Service Road 12, about 3 miles from the old logging area. Keys still in the ignition, no sign of struggle, just empty. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Forest Service Road 12 was the access road we'd taken to reach the clearing. Someone had found the truck and moved it, probably while I was sitting in the station trying to figure out what to report. That doesn't make sense either, I managed. If he was leaving for a family emergency, why would he abandon his truck in the woods? Good question. Raymond closed the folder and leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. Here's what I think happened, Johnston. I think you and Alfred went into those woods last night, looking for something you had no business looking for. I think something went wrong, and now Alfred's gone, and you're trying to cover it up with this dinner story. The accusation was delivered in Raymond's usual flat tone, but there was steel underneath it. He knew. Maybe not the details, but he knew Alfred and I had been in the woods together. Chief, I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you directly that Alfred Fowler submitted his resignation yesterday and left town for personal reasons. There is no missing person case. There is no investigation. There is a former employee who decided to relocate, and that's the end of it. Raymond stood up and I could see the conversation was over, but there was something else in his expression now, something that looked almost like warning. You've had a rough few days, Johnston. First that incident with the shadows on patrol, now this confusion about Alfred. Maybe you need some time to get your head straight. I'm putting you on administrative leave for the rest of the week. Go home, get some rest, and when you come back Monday, we'll pretend this conversation never happened. I started to protest, but Raymond held up a hand. That's not a request. Clear out your locker and go home. And Johnston, stop asking questions about things that don't concern you. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I walked out of his office in a daze. The main room was busy with the morning shift change, rangers checking equipment and reviewing assignments. None of them looked at me as I went to my locker and gathered my personal items. A few books, a spare jacket, the coffee mug my mom had given me when I got the job. Martinez was at his desk, filling out incident reports from the night shift. He glanced up as I passed, taking in the box of belongings in my arms. Everything okay, Johnston? Just taking some personal time, I said. Family stuff. The lie came easily now. I was getting good at them, apparently. Martinez nodded and went back to his paperwork, already forgetting about me. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time after that, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Alfred was dead. I'd seen it happen, heard his neck snap, watched the creature drag his body away. But according to official records, he'd resigned and moved out of state. His truck had been found and moved to make the story more believable. Someone was covering this up, and they were doing it with the kind of efficiency that suggested practice. The resignation letter bothered me the most. The handwriting had been close enough to fool a casual observer, but I'd seen Alfred's real signature dozens of times on patrol reports and equipment logs. Someone had forged it, and they'd done a decent job. But why go to that trouble? Why not just report him missing and let the case go cold like they apparently had with Miles? Unless they were worried about too many disappearances drawing attention. 2 rangers vanishing in 7 years might raise questions, especially if someone started looking for patterns. But 1 disappearance and 1 resignation, that was just normal personnel turnover. I started the truck and drove home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Raymond had said. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was almost exactly what Alfred had told me after our first encounter with the creature. Like it was a standard line, something they taught all the rangers who lasted long enough to learn the truth. My apartment felt smaller when I got back, like the walls had moved closer together while I was gone. I put my box of belongings on the kitchen counter and made coffee, trying to think through what I knew for certain. Alfred was dead. The creature had killed him, just like it had killed Miles 7 years ago. But both deaths were being covered up by people who knew about the creature's existence. Raymond was part of it, maybe had been part of it for years. The radio static, the forged resignation letter, the carefully moved truck, all of it pointed to an organized effort to hide the truth. But why? What was so important about keeping this thing secret that they were willing to let it kill people? I spent the rest of the morning going through Alfred's stories, trying to remember every detail he'd shared about Miles's disappearance, the official investigation, the search teams, the case being closed after 6 months. Had that been a cover-up too? Had Raymond been involved in hiding Miles's death the same way he was hiding Alfred's? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. How long had this been going on? How many rangers had died or disappeared over the years? And why was I still alive when both Alfred and Miles were dead? That last question bothered me the most. The creature could have killed me easily in that clearing. I'd been running blind through the woods, completely lost, making enough noise to wake the dead. But it had focused on Alfred instead, like it had a specific purpose, like it knew which one of us it wanted. By afternoon, I'd made a decision. Raymond had ordered me to drop it, to stop asking questions, to pretend none of this had happened. But Alfred was dead, because of choices I'd made, because I'd agreed to help him go back to that place. I owed him more than silence and forgetfulness. I drove to the public library in town, a small building with computers that anyone could use. I wasn't sure if the ranger station monitored our internet activity, but I didn't want to take chances. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, helped me set up an account and showed me how to access the newspaper archives. I started with local papers, searching for any mention of missing persons or unexplained deaths in the national forest. What I found made my hands shake as I scrolled through the results. Miles Allen wasn't the first. Over the past 20 years, there had been at least 6 other disappearances in the same general area: hikers, campers, even a few Park Service employees. All of them had vanished without a trace, their cases eventually going cold when search teams found nothing. But the pattern was what really caught my attention. The disappearances didn't happen randomly. They clustered around specific years: 3 in 1998, 2 in 2005, Miles in 2016, and now Alfred in 2023. 7-year cycles, just like Alfred had suspected. I printed out the articles and spread them across the library table, looking for connections. Most of the victims had been alone when they disappeared, but a few had been with partners who reported seeing strange figures or hearing unusual sounds before their companions vanished. In every case, the survivors' accounts were dismissed as trauma responses or misperceptions caused by stress and poor lighting. The official explanations were remarkably consistent. Bear attacks, despite no evidence of animal involvement. Getting lost and succumbing to exposure, despite experienced outdoorsmen who knew the area well. Equipment failures and accidents, despite gear being found in perfect condition. I was starting to see the shape of something much larger than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about one creature killing people in the woods. This was about a systematic cover-up that had been going on for decades, involving multiple agencies and levels of government. The kind of conspiracy that required serious resources and coordination. But why? What was so important about this thing that people were willing to let it kill to protect its secret? I spent hours reading through the archives, taking notes on dates and locations and victim profiles. The pattern became clearer the more data I collected. The disappearances always happened in the same general area, within a 5-mile radius of where Alfred and I had encountered the creature. They always involved people who were investigating something unusual, or who had stumbled across evidence they shouldn't have seen, and they always resulted in official explanations that didn't match the physical evidence. By the time the library closed at 6, I had a folder full of printouts and a head full of questions. I drove home as the sun was setting, thinking about Alfred's guilt and Miles's curiosity, and my own decision to keep digging despite Raymond's warnings. Whatever was controlling those woods had far more influence than I'd understood. The official records would show Alfred simply quit and left town, while Miles Allen's disappearance would remain unsolved. But I'd seen the truth, and I wasn't going to let it be buried along with the people who died trying to expose it. I was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant going against Raymond's direct orders, even if it meant risking the same fate that had claimed Alfred and Miles. Some things were worth the danger, and the truth was one of them. I spent the next 3 days staring at those printed articles, reading each one until I could recite the details from memory. The 7-year pattern wasn't a coincidence. Neither was the 5-mile radius. Whatever was in those woods had been hunting for decades, and people in positions of authority had been covering it up just as long. Raymond's warning echoed in my head every time I considered what I was planning. Administrative leave meant I wasn't supposed to go anywhere near the forest. But sitting in my apartment, surrounded by evidence of a systematic cover-up, I knew I couldn't let this go. Alfred was dead because he'd tried to find closure about Miles. Now both of them were out there, and I was the only person who knew the truth. I needed proof. Real, undeniable evidence that even Raymond couldn't dismiss or bury in some filing cabinet. The photos on my phone from that night were too dark and blurry to show anything useful. I needed to go back to that grove and document everything properly. The idea terrified me, but it was the only way forward. If I could photograph Miles's remains and the scene where Alfred died, maybe I could force someone to listen. Maybe I could prevent the next disappearance in 2028. I drove to the electronics store on Thursday afternoon and bought a decent digital camera with a powerful flash. The clerk, a kid who couldn't have been older than 20, walked me through the basic settings and showed me how to adjust for low-light conditions. I told him I was documenting wildlife at night, which wasn't entirely a lie. Back home, I practiced with the camera until I could operate it without thinking. Change settings, focus, shoot, review. The flash was bright enough to illuminate a room, which meant it should work in the forest. I charged the battery twice to make sure it wouldn't die when I needed it most. Friday evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the camera, a flashlight, and the folder of research. I'd mapped out the route to the grove, marking landmarks Alfred had pointed out during our approach. the logging road, the metal gate, the gap between the oak trees. I could find it again. The smart thing would have been to wait until Saturday night, giving myself more time to prepare. But I couldn't shake the feeling that evidence might disappear if I waited too long. The creature had moved Miles's body for a reason. Maybe it relocated remains regularly, or maybe it sensed I might return. I left my apartment at 10:30, driving the same route Alfred and I had taken 3 nights earlier. The forest roads were empty, which wasn't surprising for a Friday night in late October. Most people had better things to do than drive around the woods in the dark. The metal gate stood open, just as we'd left it. I parked in the same clearing and sat in the truck for several minutes, listening to the engine cool and the forest sounds beyond my windows. Every rational part of my brain screamed that this was suicide. I was walking alone into territory controlled by something that had killed at least 8 people over the past 25 years. But Alfred's voice kept playing in my memory. His guilt about Miles, his need to know what had happened, his determination to face whatever consequences came from seeking the truth. He'd been carrying that weight for 7 years. I'd been carrying mine for 3 days, and it was already crushing me. I grabbed the camera and flashlight, locked the truck, and headed for the tree line. The forest felt different without Alfred leading the way. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more threatening. I followed our previous path as best I could remember, using the flashlight sparingly to preserve the battery. The camera hung around my neck, bumping against my chest with each step. Navigating alone took twice as long as it had with Alfred. I missed several turns and had to backtrack when the terrain didn't match my memory. The rocky outcroppings and ravines all looked similar in the dark. By the time I found the gap between the massive oak trees, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool air. I pushed through the gap into the grove, immediately sweeping my flashlight beam toward the branch where Miles's remains had been hanging. The rope was still there, swaying slightly in the breeze, but the body was gone. I stood frozen, staring at the empty noose. 3 days ago, Miles's skeleton had been suspended from that exact spot, held together by scraps of uniform and secured with rope around the ribcage. Now only the rope remained, frayed at the end where something had been cut or torn away. My first thought was that I'd made a mistake, that this was the wrong tree or the wrong clearing. But the grove was exactly as I remembered it. Same sparse undergrowth, same pattern of moonlight filtering through the canopy, same massive oaks forming a rough circle around the open space. Someone or something had removed Miles's body in the past 3 days. I raised the camera and took several photos of the empty rope, adjusting the flash settings to capture as much detail as possible. The bright light strobed through the grove, temporarily blinding me and destroying my night vision. I blinked rapidly, waiting for my eyes to readjust while wondering if the flash had been visible from outside the grove. The yellowed note was gone too. The warning about keeping your eyes on the road had disappeared along with Miles's remains. I photographed the tree trunk where the note had been pinned, but there was no evidence it had ever existed. I spent 20 minutes documenting the grove from every angle, taking wide shots and close-ups of the rope, the trees, the disturbed ground where Alfred and I had stood 3 nights earlier. The camera's memory card could hold hundreds of photos, so I shot everything that might be relevant. As I knelt to photograph what looked like old bloodstains on the fallen leaves, I heard movement in the trees beyond the grove. Not the random rustling of small animals or wind through branches. This was deliberate movement, something large pushing through undergrowth with purpose. The same sound Alfred had identified as non-deer before we'd found Miles's body. I switched off my flashlight and crouched behind the nearest oak tree, pressing my back against the rough bark. The camera felt heavy around my neck, and I worried the strap might catch on something if I needed to run. The movement grew closer, accompanied by a dragging sound I recognized with horrible clarity. Something heavy being pulled across the forest floor, scraping over rocks and roots. I peered around the tree trunk just as the creature emerged from the gap between the oaks. It looked exactly as it had 3 nights ago, 8 feet tall, grotesquely proportioned, moving with that unnatural fluidity that defied human anatomy. But this time it was dragging something behind it, gripping the object with one massive hand while using the other for balance. The object was Alfred's body. What remained of Alfred's body. The creature had torn him apart. Alfred's torso was mostly intact, still wearing the flannel shirt he'd had on at Murphy's bar, but his limbs had been separated and arranged in ways that made my stomach lurch. The creature dragged the largest piece while smaller parts followed, connected by what looked like rope or wire. I fumbled for the camera with shaking hands, trying to activate it without making noise. The creature moved to the center of the grove, directly beneath the hanging rope. It released Alfred's remains and reached up toward the branch, testing the rope's strength with several sharp tugs. This was why Miles's body had disappeared. The creature was replacing it with Alfred's. The creature began lifting Alfred's torso toward the rope, working with methodical precision to secure it in place. Its movements were deliberate and practiced, suggesting this wasn't the first time it had performed this task. I raised the camera and framed the shot, waiting for the creature to position Alfred's body clearly in the viewfinder. My hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the camera steady, but I needed this photo. This was the evidence that would prove everything. I pressed the shutter button. The flash exploded through the grove like lightning, illuminating every detail of the scene in stark white light. The creature's twisted features, Alfred's dismembered body, the rope securing him to the branch. For one frozen moment, everything was perfectly visible. Then the creature's head snapped toward my hiding spot. Its eyes reflected the camera flash like an animal's, glowing with an intelligence that was definitely not human. Those eyes locked onto mine across the grove, and I saw recognition there. It knew I was watching. It knew I'd taken the photo. I ran. The camera bounced against my chest as I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping my face and tearing at my jacket. Behind me, the creature roared, with a sound that was part animal and part something else entirely. Trees shook as it pursued me, no longer bothering with stealth. I'd lost the flashlight somewhere in the first few seconds of running, but adrenaline and terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I leaped over fallen logs and dodged between trees, following what I hoped was the path back to the logging road. The creature's pursuit sounded different from 3 nights ago. More aggressive, more determined. The flash had done more than reveal my position. It had enraged the thing. Branches snapped behind me as the creature forced its massive frame through spaces too small for its body. I could hear it gaining ground, its breathing becoming audible over the sound of my own panicked gasping. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they might collapse, but I kept running. The alternative was ending up like Alfred and Miles, hanging from that rope in pieces. I burst through the tree line into the logging clearing just as my strength gave out. The truck sat exactly where I'd left it, keys still in my pocket. I sprinted across the open ground, fumbling for the keys while the creature emerged from the forest behind me. The engine started on the first try. I threw the truck into reverse and floored the accelerator, spinning the wheels on loose gravel as I backed toward the access road. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the creature at the forest edge, standing motionless as it watched me escape. But as I swung the truck around and shifted into drive, my headlights swept across the tree line. The creature wasn't alone. More figures stood among the trees, partially hidden by shadows, but clearly visible in the headlight beam. I counted at least 5 of them, all with the same impossible proportions and twisted features. They stood in a rough line along the forest edge, watching my escape with the same predatory intelligence I'd seen in the first creature's eyes. Some were taller than others, but all shared those grotesquely elongated limbs and misshapen heads that marked them as the same species of nightmare. I gunned the engine and tore down the access road, bouncing violently over ruts and rocks as I put distance between myself and whatever nest of horrors I'd stumbled into. The headlights swept wildly as the truck lurched from side to side, illuminating brief glimpses of trees and undergrowth rushing past. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The camera still hung around my neck, the memory card containing proof that would change everything. Photos of Alfred's mutilated remains, the creature in the act of hanging his body, and those final shots of multiple figures watching from the trees. The access road seemed longer than it had on the way in, stretching endlessly through the forest while my speedometer climbed past safe limits for the rough terrain. I didn't care about damaging the truck's suspension or blowing a tire. I needed to reach the main road and get as far from this place as possible. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't slow down. I drove straight through town and kept going, putting miles between myself and the forest before I felt safe enough to pull over. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the camera's review function, but the photos were there. Clear, undeniable evidence of what was happening in those woods. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. Less than 2 hours since I'd left my apartment, but it felt like I'd aged years in that grove. Alfred's dismembered body would be hanging from that rope now, replacing miles in whatever sick ritual the creatures maintained. I sat in the truck on the shoulder of Highway 26, staring at the camera's display screen and trying to process what I'd witnessed. The creatures weren't just random monsters hunting in the forest. They were organized, methodical, following patterns that had repeated for decades, and there were more of them than anyone had suspected. The 7-year cycle made sense now. Every 7 years, they became more active, hunting more aggressively until they'd claimed enough victims to satisfy whatever drove them. Then they retreated deeper into the woods, leaving only scattered evidence and traumatized survivors whose accounts would be dismissed by authorities. But this time was different. This time, I had proof. The transfer request forms sat on my desk Monday morning, already filled out in my destination, Olympic National Forest, Washington State. As far I could get while staying within the Forest Service system. I'd called their personnel office Friday afternoon, claiming family circumstances required immediate relocation. They had an opening for someone with my experience level, which wasn't much, but apparently they needed bodies more than expertise. I couldn't stay here, not after what I'd seen, what I'd photographed, what I knew was still out there in those woods. Every night since the grove, I'd wake up hearing Alfred's neck snap, seeing the creature's intelligent eyes tracking me through the camera flash. The images on my digital camera proved everything, but they also proved how completely alone I was in this knowledge. Santiago had made it clear the official position would never change. The creatures would keep their territory, keep their 7-year cycles, keep claiming victims who got too close to the truth. But I wasn't going to let Alfred and Miles disappear without a trace. Not completely. I spent the morning making copies of everything. The photographs printed crisp and clear at the local copy shop. The creature hanging Alfred's dismembered body, the multiple figures standing along the forest edge, the empty rope where Miles had hung for 7 years. I included my research on the disappearance patterns, the 7-year cycles, the geographic clustering. Most importantly, I wrote out a detailed account of everything that had happened, from that first encounter on patrol to Alfred's death in the grove. 12 pages of single-space text that read like something from a horror novel, except every word was true. The hardest part was deciding who to send it to. Local media was out. Too easy for Santiago and whoever else was involved to suppress or discredit. I needed people with resources, people who couldn't be easily silenced. I researched investigative journalists who specialized in government cover-ups, environmental stories, unexplained phenomena. Found 3 who seemed legitimate based on their previous work. I also identified contacts at the Regional Forest Service office in Portland, people high enough up the chain that they might actually investigate if presented with photographic evidence. Each package contained copies of the photographs, my written account, and the newspaper research showing the disappearance patterns. I sealed them in manila envelopes and drove to 3 different post offices to mail them, using my home address as the return. If Santiago wanted to trace them back to me, he could, but by then I'd be long gone. The transfer approval came through Wednesday, faster than usual, which made me wonder if Santiago had made some calls to expedite my departure. Fine by me. I had 5 days to wrap up my life in Blackwood and report to my new assignment. 5 days to get as far away as possible from those woods and whatever was still hunting in them. My last official patrol was scheduled for Friday night. Protocol required it. Couldn't leave active cases or unfinished assignments for the next person. The irony wasn't lost on me that my final shift would take me back into the same forest where Alfred had died, where Miles had hung for 7 years, where at least 6 other people had vanished without explanation. But it was just paperwork, really. Check the main access roads, radio and status reports, avoid the remote areas where normal people had no business going. I spent Thursday packing my apartment. Didn't have much. Books, clothes, some furniture I'd leave behind. The camera stayed with me, along with backup copies of all the evidence stored on a flash drive. I'd learned enough about cover-ups to know redundancy was survival. Friday evening, I put on my ranger uniform one last time. The fabric felt different now, like wearing a costume for a play I no longer wanted to be in. The badge and patches that had once made me proud now felt like targets, marking me as someone who'd gotten too close to secrets that were supposed to stay buried. The ranger station felt hollow when I arrived for my final shift. Martinez was working dispatch, gave me a nod, and handed over the patrol assignments. My route covered the main forest roads, the popular camping areas, the well-traveled trails where families came for weekend hikes. Safe territory. Tourist territory. Miles away from the old logging roads and remote groves where things hunted in the darkness. I signed out a radio and vehicle, same routine I'd followed dozens of times before. But tonight felt different. Final. Like closing a book I'd never wanted to read in the first place. The patrol started normally enough. I checked the main campgrounds, found everything quiet for a weeknight in late fall. Families had gone home, leaving the forest to the serious hikers and the things that belonged here. I radioed in status reports every hour, keeping my voice professional and calm. Just another routine patrol by a ranger who'd be gone by Monday. Around 10:30, my route took me past the intersection with Timber Ridge Road, the same stretch where Alfred and I had first encountered the creature 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks that felt like 3 years, considering everything that had happened since. I slowed the patrol vehicle as I approached the turn, muscle memory making me cautious even though I had no intention of going down that road again. That's when I saw them. The massive figure stood in the center of Timber Ridge Road, exactly where it had been that first night. 8 feet tall, arms hanging past its knees, head tilted at that impossible angle. But this time, it wasn't alone. 2 smaller figures flanked it, one on each side, human-sized but wrong in the same fundamental ways. Arms too long, proportions distorted, heads bent at angles that should have meant broken necks. They stood perfectly still in my headlights, and even from 100 yards away, I recognized them. Alfred stood to the creature's left. His ranger uniform hung in tatters, but the patches were still visible. His face had changed, features stretched and rearranged into something that resembled the original creature. His eyes reflected the headlight beams like an animal's, and his mouth had grown wider, filled with teeth that caught the light. Miles stood to the right, wearing the remains of what had once been a Forest Service uniform. 7 years of transformation had made him even less human than Alfred. His limbs had elongated, his spine curved in ways that defied anatomy. But I knew it was him from the way he stood. The tilt of his head, some echo of the man Alfred had described. All 3 figures began moving toward my vehicle. Not walking, flowing. Their movements were too smooth, too coordinated, like they were connected by invisible strings. The original creature stayed in the center, while Alfred and Miles spread out to flank my patrol car, cutting off any escape route except straight back. I threw the transmission into reverse and floored the accelerator. The engine roared and the vehicle shot backward down the main road, tires squealing on the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, I watched the three figures reach the intersection and stop, standing in perfect formation as they watched me flee. My hands shook so badly I could barely steer. Alfred and Miles weren't dead. Not exactly. They'd been changed, transformed into something like the creature that had killed them. The 7-year cycle wasn't just about hunting and feeding. It was about recruitment, about adding to their numbers, about growing stronger with each generation of victims. I drove straight back to the ranger station without completing the rest of my patrol route. Martinez looked up when I entered, probably wondering why I was back early, but I just mumbled something about equipment problems and signed out for the night. He didn't press for details, and I didn't offer any. Saturday morning, I loaded my car with everything I owned and drove out of Blackwood for the last time. The moving truck would pick up my furniture later, but I wasn't staying another night in a place where the dead walked the forest roads, hunting for new recruits to join their ranks. As I passed the town limits, I kept my eyes firmly on the road ahead. No looking back at the dark tree line. No final glances at the mountains where things moved in the shadows. I'd learned that lesson from Alfred's story about the original Rangers. Keep your eyes on the road. Don't look into the woods. Don't investigate the sounds in the darkness. Don't try to help figures standing in the middle of remote forest roads. The highway stretched ahead of me, leading away from Blackwood National Forest and toward whatever came next. I knew the truth about what happened in those woods would never be officially acknowledged. Santiago and whoever else was involved would continue the cover-up, continue dismissing reports and silencing witnesses. The creatures would keep their territory, keep their 7-year cycles, keep adding to their numbers one victim at a time. But I had survived to tell the story. The photographs were out there, the evidence was documented, the pattern was recorded. Maybe the journalists would investigate, maybe someone in the regional office would ask questions, maybe eventually the truth would surface. Or maybe not. Maybe the cover-up was too deep, too well established, too protected by people who valued secrecy over human lives. Either way, I'd done what I could. I'd survived when Alfred and Miles hadn't. I'd escaped when others had been transformed into something inhuman. I'd gathered evidence and sent it to people who might actually do something with it.